Hello, welcome to Heavy Storytime. If you guys enjoy it, make sure to like button, subscribe, and hit the bell on the video. We are going to be reading the Bible, and then my sister's going to be doing the synopsis, and then we're going to be reading Great Expectations.
It's over there.
It's over there. I hope you guys enjoy it. Dad's going to come up right now and read the Bible for you today.
Hello! Welcome to Heavy D Storytelling. Alright. Sorry about that. And my hair is not that good today. Alright. So we're on John chapter 4. Is that right? 4? John chapter 4. This is the English Standard Version. Chapters are kind of long today, so let's go ahead and get started. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well, and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." Just then his disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman, but no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with her?" So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" They went out of the town and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, 'There are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest'? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true, 'One sows, another reaps.' I sent you to reap that which you did not labor." Others have labored, and you must enter into their labor." Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. "He told me all that I ever did." So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." After the 2 days he departed for Galilee, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his hometown. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the feast, for they too had gone to the feast. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." The official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him." The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." And he himself believed, and all his household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. And that is the end of John chapter 4. I hope that God is blessing you in the reading of his word. So, next we have great expectations. So it's my job to tell you what happened in the last episode. So, basically, the little boy felt really guilty, and he was just pins and needles sitting in his seat at the dinner table, and then the soldiers came, and of course that's the beginning, and they arrested him, and they took him away and executed him, and he died. And here's Kimberly
What
to say...
What happened to his sister?
Here's Kimberly to say what really happened.
So, sorry. In the last chapter, what happened was there were soldiers at the door because they realized that there was a fugitive who was in the area, and they eventually tracked him down, and he said, "I had no accomplices, but I did go over to the blacksmith's house, and I stole a bunch of food, including a nice pie." And the blacksmith was like, "What? So you're the one who stole the pie and put tar in the I forget
the
what,
brandy.
Brandy. That was it." And so nobody could figure out how he got in because the door wasn't broken into or anything. So, this is a story they came up with. He climbed to the roof. He used a rope to climb down the chimney without getting any soot on him or the floor. And then he went into the pantry, grabbed a bunch of stuff, again without getting any soot on anything, and he grabbed a pie and went back up the chimney and off the roof. That was the best they could come up with. And of course, he's magically free of soot when he's detained. Which, considering soot is really hard to get out of hair, I bet that's quite an achievement. I'm going to hand it off to Dad, who's going to read us a story.
So now we're on chapter 7. Chapter 7 and 8 are kind of long, so if this is a long episode, then I apologize. Otherwise, we might stop at the end of 7. But I think the kids are settling in their beds, and if they're still listening, then hopefully, if they accidentally fall asleep while I'm reading, that's okay, because that's why we record it. All right. So now we're on chapter 7. At the time when I stood in the churchyard reading the family tombstones, I had just enough learning to be able to spell them out. My construction even of their simple meaning was not very correct, for I read wife of the above as a complimentary reference to my father's exaltation to a better world. And if any one of my deceased relations had been referred to as below, I had no doubt I should have formed the worst opinions of that member of the family. Neither were my notions of the theological positions to which my catechism bound me at all accurate, for I have a lively remembrance that I supposed my declaration that I was to walk in the same all the days of my life laid me under an obligation always to go through the village from our house in one particular direction, and never to vary it by turning down by the wheelwrights or up by the mill. When I was old enough, I was to be apprenticed to Joe, and until I could assume that dignity, I was not to be what Mrs. Joe called pompied, or, as I render it, pampered. Therefore, I was not only odd boy about the forge, but if any neighbor happened to want an extra boy to frighten birds, or pick up stones, or do any such job, I was favored with the employment. In order, however, that our superior position might not be compromised thereby, a money box was kept on the kitchen mantel-shelf, into which it was publicly made known that all my earnings were dropped. I have an impression that they were to be contributed eventually toward the liquidation of the national debt, but I know I had no hope of any personal participation in the treasure. Mr. Wopsel's great-aunt kept an evening school in the village. That is to say, she was a ridiculous old woman of limited means and unlimited infirmity, who used to go to sleep from 6 to 7 every evening in the society of youth, who paid 2 pence per week each for the improving opportunity of seeing her do it. She rented a small cottage, and Mr. Wopsle had the room upstairs where we students used to overhear him reading aloud in a most dignified and terrific manner, and occasionally bumping on the ceiling. There was a fiction that Mr. Wopsle examined the scholars once a quarter. What he did on those occasions was to turn up his cuffs, stick up his hair, I don't know where I got that, and give us Mark Antony's oration over the body of Caesar. This was always followed by Collins's Ode on the Passions, whereby I particularly venerated Mr. Wopsle as Revenge, throwing his blood-stained sword in thunder down, and taking the war-denouncing trumpet with a withering look. It was not with me then, as it was in later life, when I fell into the society of the Passions, and compared them with Collins and Wopsle, rather to the disadvantage of both gentlemen. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, besides keeping this educational institution, kept in the same room a little general shop. She had no idea what stock she had, or what the price of anything on it was, but there was a little greasy memorandum book kept in a drawer, which served as a catalogue of prices. And by this oracle Biddy arranged all the shop transactions. Biddy was Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's granddaughter. I confess myself quite unequal to the working out of the problem what relation she was to Mr. Wopsle. She was an orphan, like myself. Like me, too, had been brought up by hand. She was most noticeable, I thought, in respect for her extremities, for her hair always wanted brushing, her hands always wanted washing, and her shoes always wanted mending and pulling up at heel. The description must be received with a weekday limitation. On Sundays she went to church, elaborated. Much of my unassisted self, and more by the help of Biddy than of Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, I struggled through the alphabet as if it had been a bramble bush, getting considerably worried and scratched by every letter. After that, I fell among those thieves, this 9 figures, who seemed every evening to do something new to disguise themselves and baffle recognition. But at last I began in a purblind, groping way to read, write, and cipher on the very smallest scale. One night I was sitting in the chimney corner with my slate, expending great efforts on the production of a letter to Joe. I think it must have been a full year after our hunt upon the marshes, for it was a long time after, and it was winter and a hard frost. With an alphabet on the hearth at my feet for reference, I contrived an hour or two to print and smear this epistle. And it's crazy, like random letters are capitalized and it's misspelled, but I'll try to read it. My dear Joe, I hope you are quite well. I shall soon be able for to fetch you, Joe, and then we shall be so glad. And when I am I don't know what that word is. To you, Joe, what larks a believe me if an XN Pip. I really, that's like gibberish. I don't understand it. I think that's the point. There was no indispensable necessity for my communicating with Joe by letter, inasmuch as he sat beside me and we were alone. But I delivered this written communication, slate and all, with my own hand, and Joe received it as a miracle of erudition. I say, Pip, old chap, cried Joe, opening his blue eyes wide, what a scholar you are, ain't you? I should like to be, said I, glancing at the slate as he held it, with a misgiving that the writing was rather hilly. Why, here's a J, said Joe, and an O equal to anything. Here's a J and an O, Pip, and a J-O, Joe! I had never heard Joe read aloud to any greater extent than his monosyllable, and I had observed at church last Sunday, when I accidentally held our prayer book upside down, that it seemed to suit his convenience quite well, as if it had been all right. Wishing to embrace the present occasion of finding out whether in teaching Joe I should have to begin quite at the beginning, I said, but read the rest, Joe. The rest, eh, Pip? Said Joe, looking at it with a slow, searching eye. 1, 2, 3. Why, here's 3 J's and 3 O's and 3 J-O. Joes in it, Pip. I leaned over Joe, and with the aid of my forefinger read him the whole letter. Astonishing, said Joe, when I had finished. You are a scholar. How do you spell Gargery, Joe? I asked him with a modest patronage. I don't spell it at all, said Joe. But supposing you did? I can't be supposed, said Joe, though I'm uncommon fond of reading, too. Are you, Joe? Uncommon. Give me, said Joe, a good book or a good newspaper, and sit me down afore a good fire, and I ask no better. Lord, he continued after rubbing his little knees, when you do come to a J and an O, and says you, here at last is J-O, Joe. How interesting reading that is. I derived from this that Joe's education, like steam, was yet in its infancy. Pursuing the subject, I inquired, didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me? No, Pip. Why didn't you ever go to school, Joe, when you were as little as me? Well, Pip, said Joe, taking up the poker and settling himself into his usual occupation when he was thoughtful, of slowly raking the fire between the lower bars. I'll tell you. My father, Pip, he were given to drink, and when he were overtook with drink, he hammered away at my mother, most unmerciful. It were almost the only hammering he did, indeed, excepting at myself. And he hammered at me with a vigor only to be equalled by the vigor with which he didn't hammer at his anvil. You're a listening and understanding, Pip. Yes, Joe. Consequence, my mother and me, we ran away from my father several times, and then my mother, she'd go out to work, and she'd say, Joe, she'd say, now please, you shall have some schooling, child, and she'd put me to school. But my father were that good in his heart that he couldn't bear to be without us. So he'd come with a most tremendous crowd and make such a row at the doors of the houses where we was, that they used to be obligated to have no more to do with us and to give us up to him. And then he took us home and hammered us. Which, you see, Pip, said Joe, pausing at his meditative raking of the fire and looking at me, were a drawback on my learning. Certainly, poor Joe. Though, mind you, Pip, said Joe, with a judicial touch or two of the poker on the top bar, rendering unto all their due, and maintaining equal justice betwixt man and man, my father were that good in his heart, don't you see? I didn't see, but I didn't say so. Well, Joe pursued, somebody must keep the pot a-billin', Pip, or the pot won't bile, don't you know? I saw that, and said so. Consequence, my father didn't make objections to my going to work, so I went to work at my present calling, which were his too, if he would have followed it, and I worked tolerable hard, I assure you, Pip. In time I were able to keep him, and I kept him till he went off in a purple leptic fit. And it were my intentions to have put upon his tombstone that, whatsoever the failings on his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart. Joe recited this couplet with such manifest pride and careful perspicuity that I asked him if he had made it himself. I made it, said Joe, my own self. I made it in a moment. It was like striking out a horseshoe complete in a single blow. I never was so much surprised in all my life. Couldn't credit my own Ed, to tell you the truth. Hardly believed it were my own Ed. As I was saying, Pip, it were my intentions to have it cut over him, but poetry costs money. Cut it how you will, small or large, and it were not done. So, not to mention bearers, all the money that could be spared were wanted for my mother. She were in poor health, and quite broke. She weren't long of following, poor soul, and her share of peace came round at last. Joe's blue eyes turned a little watery. He rubbed first one of them and then the other, in the most uncongenial and uncomfortable manner, with the round knob on the top of the poker. It were but lonesome then, said Joe, living here alone, and I got acquainted with your sister. Now, Pip, Joe looked firmly at me, as if he knew I was not going to agree with him. Your sister is a fine figure of a woman. I could not help looking at the fire in an obvious state of doubt. Whatever family opinions, or whatever the world's opinions on that subject may be, Pip, your sister is. Joe tapped the top bar with a poker after every word following. A fine figure of a woman. I could think of nothing better to say than, I'm glad you think so, Joe. So am I, returned Joe, catching me up. I am glad I think so, Pip. A little redness or a little matter of bone here or there, what does it signify to me? I sagaciously observed if it didn't signify to him, to whom did it signify? Certainly, assented Joe. That's it. You're right, old chap. When I got acquainted with your sister, it were the talk how she was bringing you up by hand. Very kind of her, too, all the folks said, and I said along with all the folks as to you, Joe pursued with a countenance expressive of seeing something very nasty indeed. If you could have been aware how small and flabby and mean you was, dear me, you'd have formed the most contemptible opinion of yourself. Not exactly relishing this, I said, "Never mind me, Joe." "But I did mind you, Pip," he returned with a tender simplicity. "When I offered to your sister to keep company, and to be asked in church at such times as she was willing and ready to come to the forge, I said to her, 'And bring the poor little child, God bless the poor little child,' I said to your sister, 'there's room for him at the forge.'" I broke out crying and begging pardon, and hugged Joe round the neck, who dropped the poker to hug me and to say, "Ever the best of friends, ain't us, Pip? Don't cry, old chap." When this little interruption was over, Joe resumed, "Well, you see, Pip, and here we are. That's about where it lights. Here we are. Now, when you take me in the hand in my learning, Pip, and I tell you beforehand I am an awful dull, most awful dull. Mrs. Joe mustn't see too much of what we're up to. It must be done, and I may say on the sly. And why on the sly? I'll tell you why, Pip." He had taken up the poker again, without which I doubt if he could have proceeded in his demonstration. "Your sister is given to government." "Given to government, Joe?" I was startled, for I had some shadowy idea, and I'm afraid I must add hope, that Joe had divorced her in a favor of the Lords of the Admiralty or Treasury. "Given to government," said Joe, "which I mean to say, the government of you and myself." "Oh, and she ain't over partial to having scholars on the premises," Joe continued, "and in particular would not be over partial to my being a scholar, for fear I might rise, like a sort of rebel, don't you see?" I was going to retort with an inquiry, and had got as far as "why," when Joe stopped me. "Stay a bit. I know what you're going to say, Pip. Stay a bit. I don't deny that your sister comes from the mogul over us now and again. I don't deny that she do throw us backfalls, and that she do drop down upon us heavy. At such times as when your sister is on the rampage, Pip." Joe sank his voice to a whisper and glanced at the door. "Candor compels Fur to admit that she is a buster." Joe pronounced this word as if it began with at least 12 capital B's. "Why don't I rise? That were your observation when I broke it off, Pip." "Yes, Joe." "Well," said Joe, passing the poker into his left hand, that he might feel his whisker, and I had no hope of him whenever he took to that placid occupation, "your sister's a mastermind. A mastermind." "What's that?" I asked, in some hope of bringing him to a stand, but Joe was readier with his definition than I had expected, and completely stopped me by arguing circularly, and answering with a fixed look, "Her." And I ain't a mastermind?" Joe resumed, when he had unfixed his look and got back to his whisker. "And last of all, Pip, and this I want to say very serious to you, old chap, I see so much in my poor mother of a woman drudging and slaving and breaking her honest heart and never getting no peace in her mortal days that I'm dead afeard of going wrong in the way of not doing what's right by a woman, and I'd fur rather of the two go wrong the t'other way and be a little ill-conwenienced myself. I wish it was only me that got put out, Pip. I wish there weren't no tickler for you, old chap. I wish I could take it all on myself, but this is the up and down and straight on it, Pip, and I hope you'll overlook shortcomings." Young as I was, I believe that I dated a new admiration of Joe from that night. We were equals afterwards, and we had been before, but afterward, at quiet times when I sat looking at Joe and thinking about him, I had a new sensation of feeling conscious that I was looking up to Joe in my heart. "However," said Joe, rising to replenish the fire, "here's the Dutch clock a-working himself up to being equal to strike 8 of 'em, and she's not come home yet. I hope Uncle Pumblechook's mare mayn't have set a forefoot on the piece of ice and gone down." Mrs. Joe made occasional trips with Uncle Pumblechook on market days to assist him in buying such household stuff and goods as required a woman's judgment. Uncle Pumblechook, being a bachelor and reposing no confidences in his domestic servant, this was market day, and Mrs. Joe was out on one of those expeditions. Joe made the fire and swept the hearth, and then we went to the door to listen for the chaise cart. It was a dry, cold night, and the wind blew keenly, and the frost was white and hard. A man would die tonight of lying out on the marshes, I thought, and then I looked at the stars and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death, and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude. "Here comes the mare," said Joe, ringing like a peal of bells. The sound of her iron shoes upon the hard road was quite musical as she came along at a much brisker trot than usual. We got a chair out ready for Mrs. Joe's alighting, and stirred up the fire that they might see a bright window, and took a final survey of the kitchen that nothing might be out of its place. When we had completed these preparations, they drove up, wrapped to the eyes. Mrs. Joe was soon landed, and Uncle Pumblechook was soon down too, covering the mare with a cloth, and we were soon all in the kitchen, carrying so much cold air in with us that it seemed to drive all the heat out of the fire. "Now," said Mrs. Joe, unwrapping herself with haste and excitement, and throwing her bonnet back on her shoulders where it hung by the strings, "if this boy ain't grateful this night, he never will be." I looked as grateful as any boy possibly could, who was wholly uninformed why he ought to assume that expression. "It's only to be hoped," said my sister, "that he won't be Pompeyed, but I have my fears." "She ain't in that line, Mum," said Mr. Pumblechook. "She knows better." "She?" I looked at Joe, making the motion with my lips and eyebrows. "She?" Joe looked at me, making the motion with his lips and eyebrows. "She?" My sister, catching him in the act, he drew the back of his hand across his nose with his usual conciliatory air on such occasions, and looked at her. "Well," said my sister in her snappish way, "what are you staring at? Is the house afire?" Which some individual, Joe politely hinted, mentioned she. "And she is a she, I suppose," said my sister, "unless you call Miss Havisham a he, and I doubt if even you'll go so far as that." "Miss Havisham uptown?" said Joe. "Is there any Miss Havisham downtown?" returned my sister. "She wants this boy to go and play there, and of course he's going, and he had better play there," said my sister, shaking her head at me as an encouragement to be extremely light and sportive, "or I'll work him." I had heard of Miss Havisham uptown. Everybody for miles round had heard of Miss Havisham uptown as an immensely rich and grim lady who lived in a large and dismal house barricaded against robbers, and who led a life of seclusion. "Well, to be sure," said Joe, astounded. "I wonder how she came to know Pip." "Noodle!" cried my sister. "Who said she knew him?" Which some individual, Joe again politely hinted, mentioned that she wanted him to go and play there. "And couldn't she ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? Isn't it just barely possible that Uncle Pumblechook may be a tenant of hers, and that he may sometimes, we won't say quarterly or half-yearly, for that would be requiring too much of you, but sometimes go there to pay his rent? And couldn't she then ask Uncle Pumblechook if he knew of a boy to go and play there? And couldn't Uncle Pumblechook, being always considerate and thoughtful for us, though you may not think it, Joseph," in a tone of the deepest reproach, as if he were the most callous of nephews, "then mention this boy standing prancing here, which I solemnly declare I was not doing, that I have forever been a willing slave to?" "Good again," said Uncle Pumblechook. "Well put. Prettily pointed. Good indeed. Now, Joseph, you know the case?" "No, Joseph," said my sister, still in a reproachful manner, while Joe apologetically drew the back of his hand across his nose. "You do not yet, though you may not think it. know the case. You may consider that you do, but you do not, Joseph. For you do not know that Uncle Pumblechook, being sensible that for anything we can tell, this boy's fortune may be made by his going to Miss Havisham's, has offered to take him into town tonight in his own chaise cart, and to keep him tonight, and to take him with his own hands to Miss Havisham's tomorrow morning. And Laura mussy me, cried my sister, casting off her bonnet in sudden desperation. Here I stand, talking to mere mooncalves with Uncle Pumblechook waiting, and the mare catching cold at the door, and the boy grimed with crock and dirt from the hair on his head to the sole of his foot. With that she pounced upon me like an eagle on a lamb, and my face was squeezed into wooden bowls in sinks, and my head was put under taps of water butts, and I was soaped and kneaded and towelled and thumped and harrowed and rasped until I really was quite beside myself. I may here remark that I suppose myself to be better acquainted than any living authority with the ridgy effect of a wedding ring passing unsympathetically over the human countenance. When my ablutions were completed, I was put into clean linen of the stiffest character, like a young penitent into sackcloth, and was trusted up in my tightest and fearfullest suit. I was then delivered over to Mr. Pumblechook, who formally received me as if he were the sheriff, and who let off upon me the speech that I knew he had been dying to make all along. Boy, be forever grateful to all friends, but especially unto them which brought you up by hand. Goodbye, Joe. God bless you, Pip, old chap. I had never parted from him before, and what with my feelings and what with soapsuds, I could at first see no stars from the chaise cart, but they twinkled out one by one without throwing any light on the questions why on earth I was going to play at Miss Havisham's, and what on earth I was expected to play at. So Granny Bear says, Pip was hoping Joe was doing well, and if he needs anything, just ask. Pip was looking forward to being Joe's apprentice and larking about with him. Yep, they were starting to be good buds, and now I don't know what's going to happen to their relationship, so that's interesting. All right, so chapter 8 is, all right, let's go ahead and get started. Mr. Pumblechook's premises in the High Street of Market Town were of a peppercorny and farinaceous character, as the premises of a corn chancellor and seedsman should be. It appeared to me that he must be a very happy man indeed to have so many little drawers in his shop, and I wondered when I peeped into one or two on the lower tiers and saw the tied-up brown paper packets inside whether the flower seeds and bulbs ever wanted of a fine day to break out of those jails and bloom. It was in the early morning after my arrival that I entertained this speculation. On the previous night I had been sent straight to bed in an attic with a sloping roof, which was so low in the corner where the bedstead was, that I calculated the tiles as being within a foot of my elbows. In the same early morning I discovered a singular affinity between seeds and corduroys. Mr. Pumblechook wore corduroys, and so did his shopman, and somehow there was a general air and flavor about corduroys, so much in the nature of seeds, and a general air and flavor about the seed, so much in the name of corduroys, that I hardly knew which was which. The same opportunity served me for noticing that Mr. Pumblechook appeared to conduct his business by looking across the street at the saddler, who appeared to transact his business by keeping his eye on the coachmaker, who appeared to get on in life by putting his hands in his pockets and contemplating the baker, who in his turn folded his arms and stared at the grocer, who stood at his door and yawned at the chemist. The watchmaker, always poring over a little desk with a magnifying glass at his eye, and always inspected by a group of smock frocks poring over him through the glass of his shop window seemed to be about the only person in the high street whose trade engaged his attention. Mr. Pumblechook and I breakfasted at 8 o'clock in the parlor behind the shop, while the shopman took his mug of tea and hunch of bread and butter on a sack of peas in the front premises. I considered Mr. Pumblechook wretched company, besides being possessed by my sister's idea of a mortifying and penitential character ought to be imparted to my diet, besides giving me as much crumb as possible in combination with as little butter, and putting such a quantity of warm water into my milk that it would have been more candid to have left the milk out altogether. His conversation consisted of nothing but arithmetic. On my politely bidding him good morning, he said pompously, 7 times 9, boy! And how should I be able to answer, dodged in that way, in a strange place, on an empty stomach? I was hungry, but before I had swallowed a morsel, he began a running sum that lasted all through breakfast. 7, and 4, and 8, and 6, and 2, and 10, and so on. And after each figure was disposed, it was as much as I could do to get a bite or a sup before the next came, while he sat at his ease guessing nothing and eating bacon and hot roll in, if I may be allowed the expression, a gorging and gormandizing manner. For such reasons I was very glad when 10 o'clock came and we started for Miss Havisham's, though I was not at all at my ease regarding the matter in which I should acquit myself under the lady's roof. Within a quarter of an hour we came to Miss Havisham's house, which was of old brick and dismal, and had a great many iron bars to it. Some of the windows had been walled up, those that remained, all the lower, were rustily barred. There was a courtyard in front, and that was barred, so we had to wait, after ringing the bell, until someone should come to open it. While we waited at the gate, I peeped in, even then Mr. Pumblechook said, "And 14," but I pretended not to hear him, and saw that at the side of the house there was a large brewery. No brewing was going on in it, and none seemed to have gone on for a long time. A window was raised, and a clear voice demanded, "What name?" To which my conductor replied, "Pumblechook." The voice returned, "Quite right," and the window was shut again, and a young lady came across the courtyard with eyes in her hand. Eyes? With keys in her hand. I don't know where I got eyes from that. With keys in her hand. She had keys, not eyes. Keys, promise. "This," said Mr. Pumblechook, "is Pip." "This is Pip, is it?" returned the young lady, who was very pretty and seemed very proud. "Come in, Pip." Mr. Pumblechook was coming in also, when she stopped him with the gate. "Oh," she said, "did you wish to see Miss Havisham?" "If Miss Havisham wished to see me," returned Mr. Pumblechook, discomfited. "Ah," said the girl, "but you see she don't." She said it so finally, and in such an undiscussable way, that Mr. Pumblechook, though in a condition of ruffled dignity, could not protest. But he eyed me severely, as I had done anything to him, and departed with the words reproachfully delivered, "Boy, let your behavior here be a credit unto them which brought you up by hand." I was not free from apprehension that he would come back to propound through the gate. "And 16, but he didn't. My young conductress locked the gate, and we went across the courtyard. It was paved and clean, but grass was growing in every crevice. The brewery buildings had a little lane of communication with it, and the wooden gates of that lane stood open, and all the brewery beyond stood open, away to the high enclosing wall, and all was empty and disused. The cold wind seemed to blow colder there than outside the gate, and it made a shrill noise in howling in and out at the open sides of the brewery, like the noise of wind in the rigging of a ship at sea. She saw me looking at it, and she said, "You could drink without hurt all the strong beers that brewed there now, boy." "I should think I could miss," said I, in a shy way. "Better not try to brew beer there now, or it would turn out sour, boy, don't you think so?" It looks like it, miss. Not that anybody means to try, she added, for that's all done with, and the place will stand as idle as it is till it falls. As to strong beer, there's enough of it in the cellars already to drown the manor house. Is that the name of this house, miss? One of its names, boy. It has more than one, then, miss? One more. Its other name was Satis, which is Greek or Latin or Hebrew, or all three, or all one to me for enough. Enough house, said I. That's a curious name, miss. Yes, she replied, but it meant more than it said. It meant, when it was given, that whoever had this house could want nothing else. They must have been easily satisfied in those days, I should think. But don't loiter, boy, though she called me boy so often, and with a carelessness that was far from complimentary. She was about my own age. She seemed much older than I, of course, being a girl and beautiful and self-possessed, and she was as scornful of me as if she had been 21 and a queen. We went into the house by a side door. The great front entrance had 2 chains across it outside, and the first thing I noticed was that the passages were all dark, and that she had left a candle burning there. She took it up, and we went through more passages and up a staircase, and still it was all dark, and only the candle lighted us. At last we came to the door of a room, and she said, "Go in." I answered more in shyness than politeness, "After you, miss." To this she returned, "Don't be ridiculous, boy, I am not going in," and scornfully walked away, and, what was worse, took the candle with her. This was very uncomfortable, and I was half afraid, however, the only thing to be done being to knock at the door. I knocked, and I was told from within to enter. I entered, therefore, and found myself in a pretty large room, well lighted with wax candles. No glimpse of daylight was to be seen in it. It was a dressing-room, as I supposed from the furniture, though much of it was of forms and uses then quite unknown to me. But prominent in it was a draped table with a gilded looking-glass, and that I made out at first sight to be a fine lady's dressing-table. Whether I should have made out this object so soon if there had been no fine ladies sitting at it, I cannot say. In an armchair, with an elbow resting on the table and her head leaning on that hand, sat the strangest lady I had ever seen or ever shall see. She was dressed in rich materials, satins and lace and silks, all of white. Her shoes were white, and she had a long white veil dependent from her hair, and she had bridal flowers in her hair, but her hair was white. Some bright jewels sparkled on her neck and on her hands, and some other jewels lay sparkling on the table. Dresses less splendid than the dress she wore, and half-packed trunks were scattered about. She had not quite finished dressing, for she had but one shoe on. The other was on the table near her hand. Her veil was but half arranged. Her watch and chain were not put on, and some lace for her bosom lay with those trinkets, and with her handkerchief and gloves and some flowers and a prayer book, all confusedly heaped about the looking-glass. It was not in the first few moments that I saw all these things, though I saw more of them in the first moments than might be supposed. But I saw that everything within my view which ought to be white had been white long ago, and had lost its luster, and was faded and yellow. I saw that the bride within the bridal dress had withered like the dress, and like the flowers, and had no brightness left but the brightness of her sunken eyes. I saw that the dress had been put upon the rounded figure of a young woman, and that the figure upon which it now hung, loose, had shrunk to skin and bone. Once I had been taken to use some ghastly waxwork at the fair, representing I know not what impossible personage lying in state. Once I had been taken to one of our old marsh churches to see a skeleton in the ashes of a rich dress that had been dug out of a vault under the church pavement. Now waxwork and skeleton seemed to have dark eyes that moved and looked at me. I should have cried out if I could. "Who is it?" said the lady at the table. "Pip, ma'am." "Pip? Mr. Pumblechook's boy, ma'am." come to play. Come nearer. Let me look at you. Come close." It was when I stood before her, avoiding her eyes, that I took note of the surrounding objects in detail, and saw that her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9, and that a clock in the room had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. "Look at me," said Miss Havisham. "You are not afraid of a woman who has never seen the sun since you were born?" I regret to state that I was not afraid of telling the enormous lie comprehended in the answer. "No." "Do you know what I touch here?" she said, laying her hands one upon the other on her left side. "Yes, ma'am." It made me think of the young man. "What do I touch?" "Your heart." "Broken!" She uttered the word with an eager look, and with strong emphasis, and with a weird smile that had kind of a boast in it. Afterward she kept her hands there for a little while, and slowly took them away as if they were heavy. "I am tired," said Miss Havisham. "I want diversion, and I have done with men and women. Play." I think it will be conceded by my most disputatious reader that she could hardly have directed an unfortunate boy to do anything in the wide world more difficult to be done under the circumstances. "I sometimes have sick fancies," she went on, "and I have a sick fancy that I want to see some play. There, with an impatient movement of the fingers of her right hand. "Play, play, play!" For a moment, with the fear of my sisters working before my eyes, I had a desperate idea of starting round the room in the assumed character of Mr. Pumblechook's chaise cart, but I felt myself so unequal to the performance that I gave it up and stood looking at Miss Havisham in what I supposed she took for a dogged manner, inasmuch as she said, when we had taken a good look at each other, "Are you sullen and obstinate?" "No, ma'am. I am very sorry for you, and I'm very sorry I can't play just now. If you complain of me, I shall get into trouble with my sister, so I would do it if I could, but it's so new here, and so strange, and so fine and melancholy." I stopped, fearing I might say too much, or had already said it, and we took another look at each other. Before she spoke again, she turned her eyes from me and looked at the dress she wore, and at the dressing-table, and finally at herself in the looking-glass. "So new to him," she muttered, "so old to me, so strange to him, so familiar to me, so melancholy to both of us. Call Estella." As she was still looking at the reflection of herself, I thought she was still talking to herself and kept quiet. "Call Estella," she repeated, flashing a look at me. "You can do that. Call Estella at the door." To stand in the dark in a mysterious passage of an unknown house, bawling Estella to a scornful young lady, neither visible nor responsive, and feeling it in a dreadful liberty, so to roar out her name was almost as bad as playing to order. But she answered at last, and her light came along the dark passage like a star. Miss Havisham beckoned her to come close, and took up a jewel from the table, and tried its effect upon her fair young bosom, and against her pretty brown hair. "You own one day, my dear, and you will use it well. Your own, Let me see you play cards with this boy." "With this boy? Why, he's a common labouring boy." I thought I overheard Miss Havisham's answer, only it seemed so unlikely. "Well, you can break his heart." "What do you play, boy?" asked Estella of myself, with the greatest disdain. "Nothing but beggar my neighbour, miss." "Beggar him," said Miss Havisham to Estella. So we sat down to cards. It was then I began to understand that everything in the room had stopped, like the watch and the clock a long time ago. I noticed that Miss Havisham put down the jewel exactly on the spot from which she had taken it up. As Estella dealt the cards, I glanced at the dressing-table again, and saw that the shoe upon it, once white, now yellow, had never been worn. I glanced down at the foot from which the shoe was absent, and saw that the silk stocking on it, once white, now yellow, had been trodden ragged. Without this arrest of everything, this standing still of all the pale decayed objects, not even the withered bridal dress on the collapsed form could have looked so like grave clothes, or the long veil so like a shroud. So she sat, corpse-like, as we played at cards, the frillings and trimmings on her bridal dress looking like earthy paper. I knew nothing then of the discoveries that are occasionally made of bodies buried in ancient times, which fall to powder in the moment of being distinctly seen, but I have often thought since that she must have looked as if the admission of the natural light of day would have struck her to dust. "He calls the knaves jacks, this boy," said Estella, with disdain, before our first game was out. "And what coarse hands he has, and what thick boots!" I had never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt for me was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. She won the game, and I dealt. I misdealt, and as was only natural, when I knew she was lying in wait for me to do wrong, and she denounced me for a stupid, clumsy labouring boy. "You say nothing of her," remarked Miss Havisham to me as she looked on. "She says many hard things of you, but you say nothing of her. What do you think of her?" "I don't like to say," I stammered. "Tell me in my ear," said Miss Havisham, bending down. "I think she is very proud," I replied in a whisper. "Anything else?" "I think she is very pretty." "Anything else?" "I think she's very insulting." She was looking at me then with a look of supreme aversion. "Anything else?" "I think I should like to go home." "And never see her again, though she is so pretty." "I am not sure that I shouldn't like to see her again, but I should like to go home now." "You shall go soon," said Miss Havisham aloud. "Play the game out." Saving for the one weird smile at first, I should have felt almost sure that Miss Havisham's face could not smile. It had dropped into a watchful and brooding expression, most likely when all the things about her had become transfixed, and it looked as if nothing could ever lift it up again. Her chest had dropped so that she stooped, and her voice had dropped so that she spoke low, and with a dead lull upon her, altogether she had the appearance of having dropped body and soul within and without under the weight of a crushing blow. I played the game to an end with Estella, and she beggared me. She threw the cards down on the table when she had won them all, as if she despised them for having been won of me. "When shall I have you here again?" said Miss Havisham. "Let me think." I was beginning to remind her that day was Wednesday, when she checked me with her former impatient movement of the fingers of her right hand. "There, there! I know nothing of days of the week. I know nothing of weeks of the year. Come again after 6 days, you hear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Estella, take him down. Let him have something to eat, and let him roam and look about him while he eats. Go, Pip." I followed the candle down as if I had followed the candle up, and she stood it in the place where we had found it, until she opened the side entrance. I had fancied, without thinking about it, that it must necessarily be night-time. The rush of the daylight quite confounded me, and made me feel as if I had been in the candlelight of the strange room many hours. "You are to wait here, you boy," said Estella, and disappeared and closed the door. I took the opportunity of being alone in the courtyard to look at my coarse hands and my common boots. My opinion of those accessories was not favourable. They had never troubled me before, but they troubled me now as vulgar appendages. I determined to ask Joe why he had never taught me to call those picture cards jacks. Why he had ever taught me to call them jacks, which ought to be called knaves. I wished Joe had been rather more genteelly brought up, and then I should have been so too. She came back with some bread and meat and a little mug of beer. She put the mug down on the stones of the yard and gave me the bread and meat without looking at me, as insolently as if I were a dog in disgrace. I was so humiliated, hurt, spurned, offended, angry, sorry. I cannot hit upon the right name for the smart. God knows what its name was, that tears started to my eyes. The moment, tears in the ears, it rhymes, but it doesn't make sense. The moment they sprang there, the girl looked at me with a quick delight in having been the cause of them. This gave me power to keep them back and to look at her, so she gave a contemptuous toss, but with the sense, I thought, of having made too sure that I was so wounded, and left me. But when she was gone, I looked about me for a place to hide my face in, and got behind one of the gates of the brewery lane, and leaned my sleeve against the wall there, and leaned my forehead on it, and cried. As I cried, I kicked the wall and took a hard twist at my hair. So bitter were my feelings, and so sharp was the smart without a name that needed counteraction. My sister's bringing up had made me sensitive. In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice that the child can be exposed to, but the child is small, and its world is small, and its rocking horse stands as many hands high, according to scale, as a big-boned Irish hunter. Within myself I had sustained from my babyhood a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known from the time when I could speak that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Through all my punishments, disgraces, fasts and vigils, and other penitential performances, I had nursed this assurance, and to my communing so much with it in a solitary and unprotected way, I, in great part, referred to the fact that I was morally timid and very sensitive. I got rid of my injured feelings for the time by kicking them into the brewery wall and twisting them out of my hair, and then I smoothed my face with my sleeve and came from behind the gate. The bread and meat were acceptable, and the beer was warming and tingling, and I was soon in spirits to look about me. To be sure, it was a deserted place, down to the pigeon house in the brewery yard, which had been blown crooked on its pole by some high wind, and would have made the pigeons think themselves at sea if there had been any pigeons there to be rocked by it. But there were no pigeons in the dovecot, no horses in the stable, no pigs in the sty, no malt in the storehouses, no smells of grains and beer in the copper or the vat. All the uses and scents of the brewery might have evaporated with its last reek of smoke. In a by-yard there was a wilderness of empty casks which had a certain sour remembrance of better days lingering about them, but it was too sour to be accepted as a sample of the beer that was gone, and in this respect I remember those recluses as being like most others. Behind the furthest end of the brewery was a rank garden with an old wall, not so high but that I could struggle up and hold on long enough to look over it, and see that the rank garden was the garden of the house, and that it was overgrown with tangled weeds, but that there was a track upon the green and yellow paths, as if someone sometimes walked there, and that Estella was walking away from me even then. But she seemed to be everywhere, for when I yielded to the temptation presented by the casks and began to walk on them, I saw her walking on them at the end of the yard of casks. She had her back toward me, and held her pretty brown hair spread out in her two hands, and never looked round, and passed out of my view directly. So in the brewery itself, by which I mean the large paved lofty place in which they used to make the beer, and where the brewing utensils still were, when I first went into it, and rather oppressed by its gloom, stood near the door looking about me, I saw her pass among the extinguished fires, and ascend some light iron stairs, and go out by a gallery high overhead, as if she were going out into the sky. It was in this place, and at this moment that a strange thing happened to my fancy. I thought it a strange thing then, and I thought it a stranger thing long afterward. I turned my eyes, a little dimmed by looking up at the frosty light, toward a great wooden beam in a low nook of the building near me on the right hand, and I saw a figure hanging there by the neck, a figure all in yellow white, but with but one shoe to the feet, and it hung so that I could see the faded trimmings of the dress were like earthy paper, and that the face was Miss Havisham's, with a movement going over the whole countenance as if she were trying to call to me. In the terror of seeing the figure, and in the terror of being certain that it had not been there a moment before, I at first ran from it, and then ran toward it, and my terror was greatest of all when I found no figure there. Nothing less than the frosty light of the cheerful sky, the sight of people passing beyond the bars of the courtyard gate, and the reviving influence of the rest of the bread and meat and beer would have brought me round. Even with those aids I might not have come to myself as soon as I did, but that I saw Estella approaching with the keys to let me out. She would have some fair reason for looking down upon me, I thought, if she saw me frightened, and she would have no fair reason. She gave me a triumphant glance in passing me, as if she rejoiced that my hands were so coarse and my boots were so thick, and she opened the gate and stood holding it. I was passing out without looking at her, when she touched me with a taunting hand. "Why don't you cry?" "Because I don't want to." "You do," she said. "You have been crying till you are half blind, and you are near crying again now." She laughed contemptuously, pushing me out, and locked the gate upon me. I went straight to Mr. Pumblechook's, and was immensely relieved to find him not at home. So, leaving word with the shopman on what day I was wanted at Miss Havisham's again, I set off on the 4-mile walk to our forge, pondering as I went along on all that I had seen, and deeply revolving that I was a common labouring boy, that my hands were coarse, that my boots were thick, that I had fallen into a despicable habit of calling knaves jacks, that I was much more ignorant than I had considered myself last night, and generally that I was in a low-lived bad way. That's the end of chapter 8. I know this has been a little bit long edition of our story. Hopefully it's about as long as it gets. So we will see you again next time. I'm looking forward to it. Find out what happens the next time in 6 days. All right. So God bless you. Have a good night. We'll see you then. Bye.